I lost her when I was a child, but she still found a way to speak to me. A mother's love cannot be measured. It is as boundless as the sky and as priceless as life itself. This is a story about memory, one that lives in words, in touch, and in silence. I stood in front of the house that had once been my refuge but now felt like a stranger's place. The wind tousled my hair, the air filled with the scent of autumn, of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else. Something almost imperceptible yet familiar. This house. It was where my childhood had passed. I remember running through the garden, hiding behind the trees, the scent of my grandmother's cherry pie filling the entire house. I remember my mother's laughter. But now there was only silence. Somewhere behind me a car door slammed. "We need to finish today," my father said. His voice was steady but too restrained, too tense. I slowly turned around. He looked tired, distant. I nodded. Yes. We stepped inside. The scent of old wood and dust filled my nose. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling the uneven texture beneath my fingers. Photographs hung there. I stopped, staring at one of them. A woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile was holding a little girl in her arms. "Mom." "Me." I reached out and gently traced my finger along the glass of the frame. "Hi, Mom," I whispered, barely moving my lips. My father walked past. He didn't even glance at the photograph. I noticed the way his jaw tightened, how his fists clenched as if he wanted to say something, but he didn't. We started sorting through things. My grandmother's old dresses, into a box for charity. Books, into another. Dishes from which I used to eat pancakes as a child, into a third. I tried not to think about the fact that we weren't just packing up things in these boxes. We were packing up memories. I walked into my mother's room. The air here was still, as if no one had opened the windows in years. I slowly approached the bed and sat down. Everything remained just as it had been before. The vanity table, covered in a thin layer of dust. A bottle of perfume no one had touched. A small porcelain ballerina that my mother had once given me. Picked it up. What did her voice sound like? What did her laughter sound like? I remembered the lullaby she used to sing to me. I always thought I had made it up, because the words had dissolved somewhere in my childhood memories. I closed my eyes softly, clutching the porcelain figure in my hands. And then, I felt something under the bed. I bent down and saw a suitcase. It was heavy, leather, dark with metal clasps. I carefully opened it, and froze. Inside, neatly tied with a blue ribbon, lay letters. So many letters. I slowly ran my finger over an envelope with words written across it. "For Sarah." I held my breath. I felt something warm rising from deep within my chest. I picked up the first letter, unfolded it, and saw the opening words. "My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer with you." The world around me dissolved. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stared at the paper, feeling its thin edges tremble in my hands. "But know this. I have always loved you. And I always will." Tears streamed down my cheeks. I clutched the letter in my hands, realizing that I had just found a piece of my mother. And suddenly the house didn't feel so empty anymore. I didn't know how long I had been sitting on the floor, holding the letter in my hands. Mom's voice. It was here. In every word. In every curve of the letters written by her hand. She had written to me. For years. She knew that one day I would open this suitcase. She knew that I would be scared, that I would feel lost. And she had left a piece of herself for me. I wiped my tears, took a deep breath, and reached for the next letter. On the envelope it was written, "To Sarah when you turn 5 years old." I froze for a moment. I was 3 when she left. I don't remember how it happened. I only remember that one day my mother was there. And then she was gone. That my grandmother never smiled again. That my father became a silent shadow in the house. I unfolded the letter. "When you turn 5, you might be afraid of the dark. But know that darkness is only the absence of light, not something to fear. If you ever feel scared, just close your eyes and imagine that I am holding your hand." I let out a sharp breath. Memories flooded in. As a child, I was afraid of the dark. Every night, I fell asleep with my little fists clenched, as if I were holding someone's hand. I had thought it was just a childish fantasy, but now I knew. She knew that I would be afraid. She had left me words of comfort, even years after she was gone. The tears came again. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, I almost felt her hand in mine. I grabbed the next letter. To Sarah, when you turn 10 years old. I held my breath for a moment, unfolded the letter. When you turn 10, you might have your first fight with a friend. It will hurt. You will think she betrayed you, that it's the end of the world. But trust me, friendship is not just joy. It is also effort. Forgiveness is the most important thing you can learn. I inhaled sharply. I remembered that day. I was 10. I had a fight with my best friend over something trivial. I cried all night, convinced that I would never be able to talk to her again. Then my grandmother said, "Forgive her. Sometimes people don't mean to hurt you, but they do." I had thought those were her words, but now I knew. They were my mother's words. She was there even when I didn't know it. I picked up the next letter. To Sarah, when you turn 15. I unfolded it faster than the previous ones. When you turn 15, someone may break your heart. It will hurt. You will think that love is only suffering. But know this, true love does not make you suffer. It makes you stronger. I exhaled sharply. I remembered him. Ryan. The first person I loved the way only teenagers can, with desperation, completely naively. I remember how he left. How I cried into my pillow, thinking I would never be happy again. How my father silently placed a cup of cocoa in front of me. How my grandmother whispered, "Your mother would say that you deserve better." I gripped the letter tightly in my hands. Those words had always been with me. They had guided me through the years. But I never knew whose they really were. Now I knew. I grabbed the next letter. But my fingers froze when I saw the writing on the envelope. To be read on the day you realize you have found your true love. My heart skipped a beat. I slowly ran my finger over the letters. I didn't yet know what was waiting for me inside. But I knew one thing. My mother had been with me all this time. And now I felt her stronger than ever. I sat on the floor surrounded by letters. Time no longer existed. I didn't know how many minutes or hours had passed. The only thing that mattered was my mother's words. I opened letter after letter, and with each one her presence felt stronger. But then I came across something strange. The envelope was different from the others. It was older, its edges slightly darkened. And most importantly, it wasn't meant for me. The handwriting was different. My mother's letters had always been soft, slightly slanted. But this writing was precise, deliberate, yet trembling. The letters looked as though the person writing them had been fighting their emotions. I unfolded the letter, and the world around me disappeared. "Mom, I know you will read this letter after I am gone. I know you will be angry. I know it will hurt you. But please don't blame yourself." I froze. This letter wasn't for me. It was from my grandmother. My mother had written to her, knowing that she would soon die. I clenched my teeth as my eyes raced over the lines. "You have always been strong. You protected me even when I was already an adult. And I know you will want to protect Sarah. But Mom, please, let her remember me." I felt my heart tighten. Mom knew that Grandma would try to shield me from the pain, that she would be afraid to talk about her, that she would try to erase Mom's presence to make things easier for me. But Mom didn't want me to forget her. "Tell her about me, Mom. Let her know who I was. Let her remember not just my death but my life. I don't want Sarah to think that I never existed." I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep myself from breaking down. I remembered how Grandma always avoided talking about Mom, how she left the room whenever I tried to ask about her, how she forced herself to smile when I said I missed her, how she never told me stories about Mom. I had thought she didn't want to. I had thought she didn't think it was important. But now I understood. She had kept her promise, but in her own way. She hadn't told me about Mom because she thought it would make things easier for me. She had hidden the letters because she was afraid they would break my heart. She hadn't told me the truth because her own heart couldn't bear the pain. I gripped the letter tightly in my hands. Grandma had suffered too. But just like my father, she had hidden her pain to protect me. And suddenly, I saw her differently. Not as a woman who didn't want to talk about the past, but as a woman who had lost her daughter and didn't know how to keep going. I closed my eyes. I remembered her kind hands, how she braided my hair for school, how she made me wear a scarf on cold days, even when I insisted I wasn't cold, how she made soup for me when I was sick and told me that Mom used to do the same. And I understood. She loved me just as much as Mom did, just in a different way. I unfolded the letter further. And there was one more sentence. When Sarah is ready, give her my letters. I blinked. Grandma hadn't broken her promise. She had kept the letters. And when the time was right, they had found me on their own. I closed my eyes, clutching the letter. Everything was as it should be. Everything had happened exactly the way it was meant to. I took a deep breath. I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't blame her anymore. I just loved her. And when I unfolded the next letter, I knew. I was ready to keep reading. I didn't know how long I had been sitting on the floor. The suitcase lay open. Letters surrounded me. The room was no longer just a place from the past. Now it was alive. Now Mom was here again. Each letter was like a doorway into memories. Each word pulled me back to moments I had almost forgotten. I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. I was afraid that if I closed the letter, I would lose her again. I unfolded the next one. To Sarah, when you turn 18. I took a deep breath. I knew what would be inside, but I was afraid to read it. I unfolded the letter. When you turn 18, you will feel like an adult. You will think that you already understand how the world works. But my girl, adulthood is not just freedom. It is also fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of losing, fear of not becoming the person you dreamed of being. I want you to know, you don't have to be strong all the time. You don't have to prove to the world that you can do everything on your own. You can ask for help. You can cry. You can be weak. And that won't make you any less of a person. Just remember, I have always believed in you. And I always will. I gripped the letter tightly in my hands. I was 18 when I left for college. I remembered that day, how I stood in front of the door to my room, how I looked at the walls, realizing that this was now my home, and how all of a sudden I felt terribly alone. I was scared, but I didn't allow myself to admit it. I didn't call home. I didn't tell Dad that I was struggling. I thought I had to be strong, that if I cried, if I admitted I was afraid, it would mean I wasn't ready for adulthood. If only I had read this letter back then. If only I had known that Mom had already left these words for me. I would have just allowed myself to be weak. I took a deep breath. I grabbed the next letter. But when I unfolded it, I froze. On the envelope it said, "To be read on the day you realize you have found your true love." I slowly ran my finger over the letters. I didn't know if I had found the kind of love Mom was talking about. But something inside me told me, this letter was more important than all the others. I took a deep breath, and was about to tear open the envelope, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. Dad was standing in the doorway. He was looking at me, at the suitcase, at the letters scattered around. But most of all, he was looking at me, as if he was seeing me for the first time, as if he was seeing her in me. I couldn't understand that look, but in it there was pain, deep, old. I swallowed. You knew? My voice was hoarse. He looked at the letters, then at me. Yes, he said quietly. I froze. Why didn't you tell me? Dad lowered his head. He sighed, ran a hand over his face. I didn't know how. Something inside me exploded. I clenched my teeth. You didn't know how? I had been searching for her my whole life. I had begged him to tell me about her, and he had just stayed silent. I tried to remember her, Dad. My voice shook. I asked you to tell me about her. I searched for her in myself, in every photograph, in every word Grandma said. I looked into his eyes, and you just stayed silent. He closed his eyes. I saw his shoulders tremble, how he clenched his fists, how he gritted his teeth, as if trying to hold back the pain. I was afraid, he finally said. I blinked. Afraid of what? He looked at me, and I saw fear in his eyes. Afraid that if you knew what she was like, if you read her words. He swallowed. You would leave. I froze. I didn't know what to say. I had never thought about it from his side. I had always assumed he simply didn't want to talk about her. But now I saw the truth. He couldn't talk about her, because it was killing him. I took a deep breath. Slowly I reached forward, and took his hand. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. I knew, in that moment, that something had changed. Forever. I felt like something was missing. Something hidden. Something that had been here all along. But I just hadn't seen it. Slowly, I stood up and looked around the room. The letters lay scattered across the floor. But then my eyes landed on a door. I froze. That door. I remembered it. It had always been locked. As a child, I had asked Grandma what was behind it. She would look at me for a long moment before finally saying, "This room is not for you, Sarah." Back then, I didn't understand why. But now, I took a step forward, carefully placed my hand on the doorknob. It was cold. I held my breath, and pressed down. The door creaked. And suddenly, I saw it. The room was untouched by time. I didn't know what I had expected. But it wasn't this. The bed was neatly made. A bottle of her perfume still sat on the vanity table. The letters I had found were her words. But this room was her world. I stepped inside. Dust swirled in the air. I took a deep breath. And suddenly, I smelled her. Faint, warm, familiar. The scent of my mother. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I ran my hand across the table, touched the bottle of perfume, looked at the framed photographs. There was Mom, but not just her. In one of the pictures there was me, a little girl, in a white dress, smiling. Slowly, I picked up the photo, and beside it, I noticed a small journal. I hadn't known she kept one. Carefully, I opened to the first page. It was her handwriting. Sarah turned 3 today. Her smile is so bright that my hands tremble when I hold her. She is my miracle. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I turned the page. Sarah said her first word today. It was Papa. We laughed, but I feel something tighten inside me. Will I get to hear her say her first full sentence? I covered my mouth to stop a sob from escaping. Mom had known. She had felt it. That time was running out. That she wouldn't be there to watch me grow. But she had left memories. She had written down these moments, as if hoping that one day, I would read them. I closed my eyes, and the tears ran down my cheeks. I had always feared that I hadn't been important to her. That she hadn't had enough time to love me the way I had loved her. But now, I knew the truth. She had loved me with every second of her life. I heard footsteps behind me. I froze. Slowly I turned around. Dad stood in the doorway. He didn't move. He just looked. I didn't know how long he had been standing there. But in his eyes, I saw something I had never understood before. Fear. Not because I was here, but because of this room itself. I looked at him, and suddenly, I understood. This room hadn't been locked for me. It had been locked for him. He couldn't come in here. He couldn't look at her things. He couldn't breathe in her scent. He was afraid that if he opened this door, his heart would shatter completely. I took a slow step back. Have you ever been in here? Silence. Long. Heavy. And then, no, his voice was hoarse, quiet, broken. Not once. I didn't know what to say. I had thought he had tried to forget her, that he had erased all traces of her. But now I saw the truth. He hadn't erased her. He just couldn't touch any of it, because it would have destroyed him. I lowered my gaze. My fingers tightened slightly around the journal. I wanted to hand it to him, but he didn't move. These are her notes, Dad. He didn't answer. I opened the journal and read aloud. Sarah drew a picture of our family today. She drew me with wings. I asked her why. She said, "Because you're my angel." I looked up. He was still standing in the doorway, but his shoulders had slumped, as if those words had broken something inside him. I continued. Today, Sarah kissed my forehead before bedtime for the first time. For a moment, I felt like I was dissolving in it. He closed his eyes. I heard his unsteady breath. He wanted to leave. I could see it, but he didn't. I took a step toward him, reached out my hand, took his in mine. Dad. He flinched. I felt him resisting, but I knew, if he left now, if he locked this door again, he wouldn't come back. He would lose me again. I squeezed his hand tighter. Please. I was asking him to stay. He took a deep breath. Slowly he reached out and took the journal. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the paper. I watched his chest rise and fall with uneven breaths. But he didn't hand the journal back. He held it in his hands. And that meant that he was finally ready to remember her again. Dad stood in the doorway of Mom's room. But now he wasn't just looking. In his hands was her journal. He held it tightly, but I could see how his fingers trembled slightly, as if he was battling himself, deciding whether he could turn the first page. I didn't rush him. I just stood beside him. Just waited. Finally, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and slowly opened the journal. I didn't know what he would read, but I knew one thing. It would change everything. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Dad didn't say a word. Only his breathing was uneven, his shoulders tense. I couldn't see his face, but suddenly, his fingers tightened, then relaxed. He ran a hand over his face, as if trying to wipe away the pain that had overtaken him. And then, he closed the journal and lifted his gaze to me. I saw tears in his eyes. Dad hardly ever cried. In my entire life, I don't think I had ever seen his tears. But now, they were there. I didn't know what to say, but maybe I didn't have to, because he already understood everything on his own. I want to show you something, he suddenly said. I blinked. What? Just come with me. I didn't ask where. I just followed him. We stepped outside. The sun had already begun to set, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. I walked behind my father, not knowing where he was leading me. But then, I saw the old shed. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I frowned. Dad, what are we? But he was already reaching for the lock and opening the door. Inside it smelled of dry wood, old varnish, and something almost forgotten. He stepped inside and pulled out a small box, placed it in front of him. Cautiously I stepped closer. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. And inside, I saw it. The toy horse. Mine. I froze. It was the very same toy I had fallen asleep with as a child. The one I had lost when I was little. I had thought it was gone forever. But it was here. I looked up at Dad. You kept it? He didn't answer right away. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost uncertain. He swallowed hard. I couldn't let go. I blinked. I didn't know what to say. I had always thought he wanted to erase the past. But now I saw the truth. He had held on to it, just like I had. I looked into the box. There were my childhood drawings. The locket I had lost when I was 7. The fairy tale book Mom used to read to me before bed. I covered my mouth with my hand. Oh my God! I couldn't believe it. All these years, he hadn't thrown anything away. He had held on to her, just like I had. Slowly I reached forward, picked up the locket, felt its cold metal against my palm. I closed my eyes, and the tears came on their own. I had thought I had lost her forever, but now I understood. She had never disappeared. She had always been with us. We just couldn't see her. I took a step toward Dad, then another, and before I even realized it, I hugged him. I felt him freeze, felt his breath catch, felt his body tense. And then, his arms wrapped around me, tightly, as if he was afraid that if he let go, even for a second, I would disappear. As if he didn't want to lose me again. I felt his chest rise with uneven breaths. I heard him swallow hard. I understood. He was crying. I love you, Dad. I whispered. He inhaled sharply. And on the exhale, so softly I barely heard it. I love you too, Sarah. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in years I felt safe. I didn't know how long we stood there like that. I didn't want to let go first. And it seemed like he didn't either. I could feel him slowly calming down, his breathing becoming steadier, but his arms still held me tightly, as if he couldn't believe I was here, that I wasn't angry anymore, that I didn't blame him anymore. I gently pulled away. He looked at me. Thank you, I said softly. He nodded but didn't respond. I understood. There were too many words he couldn't say out loud, but now I could read them in his eyes. I looked back at the box, at all these memories he hadn't been able to throw away. I ran my fingers over the toy horse. The small worn spots on it felt like living scars of the past. "Did you ever talk to her?" I suddenly asked. He froze. "Talk to who?" I looked at him. "Mom." My words caught him off guard. He blinked, ran a hand over his face, but didn't answer right away. I understood. He had never spoken to her after she was gone. I always had. In whispers. In my mind. Sometimes when I felt sad I spoke to her, even if there was no answer. But he had just stayed silent. As if, by saying her name, he would lose her completely. As if her existence depended on his silence. "She's still here, Dad," I said gently. He flinched. I took his hand. "You can tell her everything you never got the chance to say." He clenched his jaw. I could see him struggling with himself. How his chest rose heavily with his breath. How he looked away again, because looking at me was too painful. I understood. He couldn't do it, but I could do it for him. I took a deep breath, and I said her name. "Mom." Dad closed his eyes, but I didn't stop. "We found your letters." My voice trembled, but I kept going. "We were reading them." My fingers shook, but I knew that if I didn't say this now, I never would. "You were right. We both got lost. We were both too scared to talk to each other." I swallowed hard. "But now we hear you." I looked at Dad. Slowly he lifted his head. "You can tell her anything you want, Dad." I knew. This was a turning point. Either he would shut the door to the past forever, or he would find the courage to open it. He took a deep breath. His lips trembled. I waited for him to say her name, but instead, he simply exhaled and said quietly, "I miss you." Just 2 words, but they were enough. I nodded, wiping away my tears. It was his first step, and now I knew it wouldn't be his last. The house filled with morning light. Warm rays of the sun filtered through the curtains, painting the walls in soft golden hues. I sat on the floor surrounded by letters. They lay before me. Unfolded, reread, remembered. I ran my fingers along the edge of one of the envelopes. Each letter was a bridge to the past. Each word, her voice alive, gentle, real. I had read them all, but this time, I knew this wasn't the end. I ran my palm over the worn cover of an old notebook that had once belonged to Grandma. She had always kept it close to her, and now I understood why. Notes. Words that must be said, even if there is no one left to say them to. I glanced at the stack of paper beside me, and suddenly I knew what I had to do. I had to write my own letter. I picked up a pen, took a deep breath, and began to write. "Dear Sarah, when you find this letter, you may be 30, or 40, or 50. You may already be a mother, or a grandmother. But whoever you are, wherever you are, this letter is for you. For the person you will become in the future. I want you to know, you are not alone anymore. You were never alone. I know that sometimes you will still feel sad. Sometimes you will look in the mirror and search for her in your reflection. Sometimes you will hear her voice in your mind, but it will sound quieter than before. That doesn't mean you are losing her. She is always with you. You carry her within you. You are a part of her. Do you remember how you were afraid of the dark as a child? How Mom told you to close your eyes and imagine she was holding your hand? This is the same. If you ever feel afraid, just close your eyes. She is still holding your hand, and I know that in the future you will still have fears. You will be afraid of making mistakes. You will be afraid of forgetting her voice. But know this, mistakes are part of life, and she would never want you to live in fear. I hope that you are happy. I hope that you have found the kind of love she wrote about. And if you have, read her letter again. Absorb every word. She didn't write it for nothing. She wanted you to know what true love is. And if you are still searching, don't be afraid. Mom said that love isn't always something we seek. Sometimes love finds us. I don't know where you will be when you find this letter, but I want you to do one thing. Look at the stars. Mom used to say that every person is a part of starlight, that those we lose never really disappear. They just become something else. They become the light that guides us. I want you to remember, you are her light. And if one day you ever feel like you are losing her, just lift your head and look at the sky. She's there. Always. I set the pen down. My hands trembled slightly. I reread the letter, and I realized this letter wasn't just for my future self. It was for anyone who had ever felt alone, for anyone who had searched for light in the darkness, for anyone who had been afraid of forgetting. I folded the paper and carefully placed it inside the suitcase, among Mom's letters. Now mine was there too, because this story needed to continue. I lifted my head and looked out the window. The sky was clear, bright, endless. I smiled. I knew she could see me. She was proud of me. And maybe someday my daughter or granddaughter would find this letter, and then the story would go on. I sat by the window holding the suitcase on my lap. I felt its weight, not just the physical weight but the emotional one. This was the suitcase of my mother's love, my mother's memory, my mother's life. I thought my search had ended, that I had found everything I was meant to find. But something inside me still stirred, as if something was left unsaid. I looked at the suitcase, at its worn edges, at the lock that barely opened after so many years. I ran my fingers over the leather, as if I could feel my mother's hands when she last closed it. I knew it had to come with me, that I couldn't just leave it behind. But now I wasn't thinking only about myself. I was thinking about how, one day, someone else would find this suitcase too. Someone who would be searching for answers just as I had. Someone who would hold these letters and cry, just as I had cried. Someone who would lose but then find again. I didn't want this story to end. I wanted it to live on. I took a blank sheet of paper, and I began to write. If you are reading this letter, it means you have found this suitcase. Once it belonged to my mother. She left it for me, knowing that one day I would find it and see that love never truly disappears. Now it belongs to you. I don't know who you are. Maybe you are my daughter, maybe my granddaughter, or maybe you are just someone who once felt lost. If you are reading this letter, it means you are searching for something important, something that feels lost. But believe me, you are not lost. You are not alone. Love always remains. In words, in memories, in the things that are passed from hand to hand. I want you to know, you are loved, even if you don't feel it, even if the world seems too cold. I don't know what you are going through, but I know that you are stronger than you think. I know that you will find light, even if right now all you see is darkness. And when things get difficult, look at the sky. The stars always shine for us, just like love, just like those who have left but never truly left us. And if one day you decide to leave this letter for someone else, write your own words too. Leave a piece of yourself. Let this story continue. Let love be passed forward. With love, Sarah. I folded the letter, wrapped it with a blue ribbon, just as my mother once had with her letters, and carefully placed it inside the suitcase. Now it was filled not just with the past, but with the future. I rose from the floor, took one last look at the room. I knew I would never return here, but now I wasn't afraid to leave, because everything that truly mattered, I was taking with me. The house was quiet, but now that silence wasn't emptiness, it was warmth. It no longer scared me. I sat on my old bed, holding the last letter close to my chest. It wasn't written by Mom. I had written it. I left it in the suitcase among her letters, as if I was telling her, I understand. I heard you. And now I'm ready to move forward. I looked at the suitcase. It no longer seemed old and dusty. Now it was a treasure, a part of me. I knew it would come with me, because Mom had to stay close. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I knew it was time to leave, but I wasn't ready just yet. I wanted to remember this place as it was now, not as something dark, not as something filled with loss, but as something alive, filled with voices. Her voice. I stood up and walked to the mirror. I looked at my reflection, and suddenly, I saw her in me, not just in the color of my eyes or the curve of my lips. I saw her in the way I held my head, in the way I looked at the world. I smiled. Thank you, Mom. Thank you for the letters. Thank you for never leaving me alone. Thank you for helping me find Dad again. Thank you for everything. Asterisk. I turned to the door, took a step forward, but suddenly, I felt something, like a gentle breeze brushing against my shoulder, like an invisible touch, as if someone had softly run their fingers through my hair. I turned around sharply. No one. But I wasn't afraid. I just knew. She was here. She would always be here. I smiled and walked out of the room. Dad was waiting by the car. He looked different. Not as burdened as he had on the day I arrived. There was something else in him now, as if he had finally let go of the weight he had carried for so many years. I walked up to him. He looked at me. Ready? I nodded. Ready. We both looked at the house. It was going to be sold. But I knew. A home wasn't walls. It wasn't old belongings and furniture. It wasn't photographs covered in dust. A home was memories. And no one could take those away from me. Dad took a deep breath. And then, he held out his hand to me. I froze. He had never done that before. Slowly, I reached out and took his hand. We stood there for a few moments. And in that moment, I understood. We had found each other again. We had lost each other years ago, but now we were together. And Mom would have wanted that. I smiled at him. We got into the car and drove away. As we reached the highway, I looked out the window. The sky was clear and blue. Sunlight broke through the clouds, bathing everything in a warm golden glow. I looked up, and suddenly, I saw a bird soaring high in the sky, alone, free, and I knew it was her. Mom. She was watching over me. She was proud of me. I smiled. Now I knew for sure. I was never alone. She was always with me. Always. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.